So today we're going to start writing our own classes, or this unit. The first half of it is going to be what it means to write a class, and then the second half that we'll probably start on Friday will be like writing methods and stuff like that, which so also part of the second class is when you write classes, you can designate certain parts of them as like private and public and static and things like that. You've seen some of those, but I haven't really explained them yet. So that's what we're going to do this week. Alrighty. So we didn't really use the Mr. Potato Head example that much, but I can explain it using that analogy. We did talk about how a class is like a blueprint, right? A class in and of itself doesn't do anything. You can't run a class, right? The first thing you have to do with a class is create an object. So we did work on creating objects. So if I define a class of student with name and age and GPA and address and all this stuff, all I'm doing is defining what like properties it has and what I can do with that class. It doesn't make any students. It's just the blueprint. So in order to create an actual student, Bob, right, I have to create an object called Bob based on the template of that class. So a class is a blueprint. So the analogy they use is Mr. Potato Head. And basically, your Mr. Potato Head can have a number of eyes, a number of arms, the color of their eyes. You have all these little pieces that you can stick on a Mr. Potato Head, right? But the template doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. It just says, here are all the possibilities. So it has characteristics or properties and behaviors or methods, right? You can make the Mr. Potato Head talk or move or yell. You can change some of the properties with methods. So for example, I think we had a car class at some point, and we had a method that set the type of car. Or did we do that in the constructor? We did that in the constructor. But anyway, the constructor is a method as well. So the idea being, if you want to create a Mr. Potato Head, you need to know what properties and methods it has, right? You need to know how to put it together. So in order to create a specific Mr. Potato Head object, you have to look at the blueprint and then fill it in with your specific properties for your specific object. That's called creating an instance of an object or instantiating it. So usually, right, we create an object because we want it to represent something, right? A specific student or a specific tree or a specific car, right? It's no longer just the generic, oh, this is what makes up a car or a student. Now we want it to represent a very specific car or a very specific student. And so we have to instantiate an object from the blueprint of that class. So like a house, right? You might have, 100 houses with the same blueprint, but each one of those houses is unique. Each one is an object and has its own properties. So that's the difference between a class and an object. So we use the words attributes and properties kind of interchangeably. technically, the properties belong to the class and the attributes belong to an object, but you'll see them used interchangeably. Basically, they're the variables inside your class, right? So a student name equals Bob. So Bob is an attribute. The name is an attribute of that particular student. So you have to store that inside the class somewhere. And we've seen that before with our objects. You know, we have variables stored inside our objects. And then we have methods, and hopefully you are all familiar with methods now. You have your class defines a method, and then you can call that method on your object. So turtle forward 100, right? You moved, or Yertle is the name of the object, and then you called the method forward 100, moved that specific turtle 100 pixels forward, right? Turn 90 degrees turns the turtle, right? So methods do something to the object. Sometimes I call them functions by accident because a lot of programming languages call them functions, but I'm supposed to call them methods in Java. All right, so we have used different classes before. We've used turtle, scanner to scan in input. I didn't cover that very much. I just kind of used it and didn't explain it. But we did use the math class to do random. The scanner we used for the guessing game. And then we used various shape classes from Unit 2. So we've also written a few simple methods, right? You've done that both in the CS Awesome textbook and on the quizzes and exam. You filled in methods, but I didn't make you write any from scratch. Really come up with your own. You were just filling in the bare bones for the questions, and we're actually going to get into writing them from scratch now. So in general, every class is going to start with the declaration public class. And we always capitalize the first letter of the class name. Technically, you don't have to do that. Java doesn't care, but it makes it much easier to read and understand, both for other programmers and for yourself when you're trying to figure out what is a class and what isn't a class. So in this example, we're going to create a class called house, and you can see that the first letter is capitalized, and we started with the words public class. And public in this case means that anyone can use this class definition to create their own house objects. Public means anyone can see it. As long as they can see this file, they can use it. So in this case, public class means anyone can create house objects. And you can see how to do that at the bottom, right? We've done that a lot. We've done that with turtles. We've done that with cars. Now we're doing it with houses. So the top part of this black box shows kind of how you would declare a class. And then the bottom part shows how you would instantiate a new house. So hopefully that's familiar. So I just want to pause for a second and make sure everybody's cool with this. Give me a plus minus tilde if you are comfortable with where we are so far, with basically mostly review so far. Wow, Tony is super confident. Awesome. All right. Excellent. So let's create a person class. Again, we're always going to start with public class and then the name that is capitalized. So we want to store some variable about a person. So we're going to make properties or attributes for that person. So in this example, we're going to make a contact list. So we need their name, their email, and their phone number. So right after you declare the name of the class is where you put your instance variables or your private properties here. And the reason, we're going to get to this later, but I want to stick it in your mind right now. The reason that these are called private is because we only want to be able to change them from within our own class, right? We don't want other people or other objects to be able to change the name of a person without kind of going through our own checks and balances. Like, we're going to make our own methods to set these and read these and do all sorts of fun stuff with them. And in those methods, we're going to make sure that, like, the email address is a valid email and the phone number is a valid phone number. So we want to be able to control who gets to set these properties and how they get to set them and read them. So that's why we make them private. So we called it public class because anybody can create a person object, but we called them private variables because we only want to change them. We don't want people just willy-nilly going in and changing the name and the email and the phone number. We want to do that within our class in a controlled way. So only code, only methods within our own person class will be able to change these variables. Nobody else will be able to change them. That's what private means. You can think about it as private is stored inside your house. And so nobody can get in and just change stuff willy-nilly. So now we have our variables, our properties of our class. So to create a person, right, we need a constructor. Constructor has to be public, right, because you need other classes to be able to use your object. If you want them to be able to create your object, your constructor, the constructor makes an object, has to be public. It has to be able to be seen by other classes. So the constructor always uses the same name as the class. That's what makes it a constructor. So when you say turtle Yertle equals new turtle, right? That new turtle at the end of it is calling a constructor. If we say person Mr. Bartus equals new person, it's going to call this constructor. And because this method, this constructor method, is inside the class, we can access those private variables. Remember, private just means you can't access it from other places. You can access all those variables from inside your class, inside your house. So when they pass in these parameters, init name, init email, init phone num, right? We can immediately set the name, email, and phone number, these private variables here, we can set them immediately in the constructor because we're in the same class. So what this constructor is doing is taking init name and storing it in this property name, in the private property. So when you create a new person, you have to send it a name, an email, and a phone number, and it'll store that in your new object. Are there any questions on that? My washing machine would like you to know that it is done. It is very happy that it is done. Init. Oh, so those are just variable names. So technically, you could make them the same. You could say in this red line, string name, string email, and string phone number. And then you would say name equals name, email, but that would be really confusing. So what they've done here is you can call these variables anything you want, A, B, C, N, E, and P for name, email, and phone. It doesn't matter. You can call variables whatever you want, but what they've done is they called it init name to remind you that you're going to initialize the name property with what comes in first in the constructor. And you're going to initialize the email with what comes in second. And you're going to initialize the phone number with what comes in third. So you could call it ABC, but this way, both the programmer who's looking at this at like your class and your future self that needs to use this class both remember, okay, I need to pass in a name, an email, and a phone number. And inside the constructor, it's going to set them to whatever I passed in as parameters to that method. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a really good question. That's confusing for a lot of people. Why are these variables named the way they are? They can be named, a lot of people will put in like input name, input email, input phone number, or put in like an underscore just to keep it separate, underscore name, underscore email. You can call them whatever you want, but it's good practice to call them something related to where you're storing it in your object. So yeah, that's a really good question. All right, so now we can create a person object, right? Using this constructor, we could say person Mr. B equals new person, name in quotation marks Mr. B, email in quotation marks Joe Bartus at rochesterschools.org, phone number in quotation marks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it would create an object. But it can't do anything. All we're doing right now is storing those variables. Right? When you create it, you can store it, but you can't do anything. You can't even read them. You can't even get them back at this point because we haven't done any of that. So we're going to write a method that will print out the data that you stored. So here's our constructor person. It sets all those properties. And all we want to do is add a method that prints out the data that we stored. So we're going to call it print. And again, because it is inside the person class, we can access those private variables. So we can print the name, we can print the email, we can print the phone number. Because those are stored as class properties or attributes. So those are stored and saved wherever your object is. It's stored inside those and only inside those. So you can't access it from anywhere else, except now at least we can print them out. We could say person Mr. B equals new person, blah, 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 blah. And then we could say Mr. B dot print, and it would print out my name, email, and phone number. So here are some examples. We can now use it to create a person. We're going to call it P1. We could call it whatever we want, person 1, P1, Mr. B, whatever. We call our constructor, and these should be in quotation marks. That is actually really bad that they didn't do that. I'm going to make a note of that. And we can call the print method. So those are the only things we can do with our class right now. We can create a person using the constructor in the middle, and we can print out their details with the print method. So you might see this. It's a class diagram. I'm not going to spend much time on it. It's just a more formal way to show what is in a class. So I'm not going to worry about that. You just might see it. These are the methods, have a plus beside them. The instance variables have minuses, and they don't have any parentheses. And the class name and the constructor both have the same name all the time. So yeah, I'm not going to spend time on that. So I'm not going to say most methods are public. Methods can be either public or private. So the example here is, say you want to have an average method, but you don't want other people to use your add method, right? That's inside of it. So you want to get the average of two numbers, and you want to let other people like get the average grade, for example. So you would want someone to be able to say student Bob equals new student, and then print Bob dot average. But you don't want to be people to say print Bob dot add, because it doesn't make sense to add two grades together, right? You don't want to show that to people outside of your class, but you still need to use it to calculate the average. So that's why you make add private, because it's like a helper class, a helper method to all these other methods that you might use inside your own class for other purposes. But you don't want to let other people do that because it doesn't make sense for them to be able to access it. So that's why you can call it private. Just like the private variables you don't want people messing with, this private method add you don't want people messing with. All you want them to be able to see is the average. So that's why average is public. So yeah, so this is an example. Class main, right, tries to create a new math object and then call add. Well, add was private, so you can't call it. It'll say has private access. So public means anyone can use it. Private means you can only use it inside your own class. So there are setters and getters. This is how we access private variables. You make a public get variable name and a public set variable name. They have change name here. I prefer explicitly using get and set with the variable name. So for example, name is a private string in our object. So you can't just print out object.name. It won't work because it's private. You'll get an error. But I can make a public string method. So this means that getName is going to return a string. It's going to send back a string to whoever asked for it. On the other hand, setting or changing the name, it says public void, and void means I don't get anything back, which makes sense. If I'm just changing the person's name, I don't expect to get back anything. I mean, maybe I would get a success or failure code or something, but in this case, I don't really need to. So when I'm getting the name, it's public string because I'm expecting a string back from this method. When I'm setting it, I have to pass in a string, new name, but I'm not getting anything back. So it's public void. So the getter just returns whatever is in the variable here, name, and the setter changes the name to whatever I passed in. So this is how you change and retrieve private variables from outside your class. And the reason you do it this way again is, say somebody tries to set a name to 80% and a grade to Bob. You don't want to let them do that, right? If you just had public variables, then anybody could set them to anything they want. But by having change name be a method, you can make sure that grades are between 0 and 100 before you set them. You can make sure that names are strings and not numbers, or, you know, have a certain number of characters, right? You don't want blank names. So you can do a lot of checking before you actually set it. So I'm not going to worry about this. I'm not going to worry about this. So for 5.1, what I want you to understand is that classes are all public. Start with a capital letter. The constructor has the same name as the class. There are almost always private variables inside your class, because those are the attributes of your object. Those are the properties. Those are what make it special, right? The whole point of an object is to store data. So your private variables inside that are the data you are storing. In order to access that data, you have public methods called accessors and mutators, or as I like to say, getters and setters. But you can have more complicated methods too, right? Like calculating average and whatever, depending on what your class is supposed to do. So generally speaking, your properties are private and your most methods are public, unless you have a reason not to show it to the world, right? So that's pretty much it for 5.1. So I'm going to give you some time. I'm going to put you in pairs again. Give me a plus minus squiggly for how we feel about 5.1. And if there are any questions before I put you in groups, let me know. So plus minus squiggly for all the things I just talked about.